The silence of a rainy Tuesday morning in Chicago is usually broken by the sounds of the city waking up, but for Arthur Miller, it was marked by the heavy thud of a steel-toed boot against his front door. He was a man who had spent 3 years working double shifts at a local distribution center, trying to provide a stable life for his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. When the camera crew arrived, they weren't there to capture a tragedy. They were there to capture content. A gritty segment for the evening news about the rising cost of living. They filmed Arthur clutching a small cardboard box containing his life's work, his dignity, and his daughter's favorite teddy bear. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just stared at the camera with an emptiness that felt like a permanent scar. Millions of people watched that clip, but for Elena Vance, the billionaire CEO of Vanguard Properties, that specific street corner was not just a news backdrop. It was a property she had personally signed off on as a flagship housing initiative for families in need. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The irony was suffocating because Elena had been told that her building, the Heritage Heights complex, was operating at full capacity with satisfied tenants. Seeing Arthur on the television felt like a glitch in her reality. She sat in her office, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the skyline, and pulled up the original digital blueprint of the building. Her eyes traced the address. It was correct. The eviction notice taped to his door clearly displayed the Vanguard seal. She had built this company on the promise of social responsibility, yet here was a man being discarded from her own investment like trash. The discomfort grew into a cold, hard resolve. She needed to know who had authorized the removal of a man she had promised to protect. Elena began her investigation by pulling the internal logs for Heritage Heights, expecting to find a simple clerical error or a misunderstanding regarding rent payments. Instead, she found a ghost. Every eviction notice in the building over the past 6 months had been signed by a property manager named Marcus Thorne, an individual who, according to her HR files, didn't actually exist. The deeper she searched, the more the foundation of her own company began to look like a house of cards. She realized that while she had been busy attending galas and board meetings, someone had been systematically clearing out the residents of her buildings. These weren't just random evictions. They were targeted displacements. Arthur Miller was just the latest casualty in a machine that seemed to prioritize something else entirely. The mystery of why a property manager would go through the trouble of forging her signature to kick out hardworking families started to feel like a calculated attempt to empty the building entirely. As Elena spent her nights digging through archival footage of the building's construction, she discovered an anomaly in the architectural reports. The basement level of Heritage Heights was listed as a storage area, yet the utility costs for that floor were astronomically high, rivaling the energy usage of a small skyscraper. It was physically impossible for a storage room to consume that much power. When she cross-referenced the electricity bills with the corporate accounts, she found that the payments were being routed through an offshore holding company that shared the same registered agent as the firm responsible for the management of her properties. The reality started to become clear. The building was not being managed as a home for families. It was being used as a cover for something much larger and far more hidden. The residents were not just tenants. They were witnesses who were being pushed out to ensure total isolation for whatever was happening beneath their feet. The investigation moved from the digital realm to the physical as Elena decided to visit the property under the guise of an anonymous buyer. The neighborhood was quiet, almost unnervingly so. She approached the building and noticed the windows on the lower levels were reinforced with heavy steel shutters, something that definitely wasn't in her original design plans. She managed to slip inside during a shift change, moving toward the basement access door she remembered from the blueprints. The air grew cold and hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled her teeth. When she finally pried the door open, she didn't find storage boxes or maintenance supplies. She found an entire infrastructure of high-end, industrial-grade cooling systems and rows of flickering server racks that stretched into the darkness. Her own company had been using the space she dedicated to families to house a massive, illicit data mining facility. They were running an operation that required constant cooling and massive electricity, and to keep it running, they had needed the building empty. Arthur Miller, back at a temporary shelter, was still trying to process the loss of his home. He had no idea that his eviction had been the catalyst for Elena's discovery. He spent his days applying for jobs, carrying his daughter's hand, never knowing that the woman who owned the building that threw him out was currently fighting to undo the harm. Elena returned to her office, not as the CEO, but as a person who had just seen the heart of her company turned into a hollow shell. She realized that the board of directors, the very people she trusted with her father's legacy, had been orchestrating this for years. They weren't just stealing rent. They were using the real estate assets to power an operation that existed entirely off the books, shielded by the optics of her charity work. The evidence was damning, but exposing it meant destroying everything she had spent her life building, including her own reputation. The final confrontation happened in the boardroom, a place where Elena had always felt safe. She arrived with the physical files, the energy invoices, and the proof of the unauthorized server installation. The members of the board looked at her with a calm, practiced indifference that was far more terrifying than any open hostility. They didn't deny it. They simply explained that her philanthropy was merely the overhead cost for their true business ventures. They had treated Arthur and the other families as nothing more than acceptable losses in a game they never invited her to play. Elena realized that she wasn't the one in charge. She had been the mascot for a venture that viewed human lives as obstacles to be removed. She walked out of that building knowing that the only way to seek justice was to turn herself into the authorities alongside the people who had used her name to commit such deep, calculated betrayal. In the end, the scandal brought down the board and triggered a federal investigation that lasted for years. Arthur Miller eventually received a settlement that allowed him to provide a real future for his daughter, though the memory of that rainy Tuesday never fully left him. Elena lost the company, her wealth, and her status, but she gained a clarity that no amount of money could buy. The server farm was dismantled, and the building was eventually turned into a true, non-profit community center. Yet, the story left a lasting question for everyone who watched the news that day. Was it a coincidence that a billionaire happened to be watching the television at the exact moment a single father's life was being dismantled? Or was it a reminder that even in a world governed by profit, the truth has a way of rising to the surface? You be the judge.